With this video, I'd like to introduce us to a few big ideas about river ecology that will help us understand, perhaps, how to restore river systems. So I'm going to go through some big ideas that we'll then later discuss in class. So the first idea is that, as you are probably aware, rivers integrate a vast scale across the landscape. So most of us are familiar with this scale. We don't often think about this scale. So we walk by a river on a trail and we can observe pools and riffles. But of course, this river keeps going, flows into another body of water and another and another and another, and eventually ends up at an ocean. So one of the philosophical ways of saying this is that everybody lives downstream from someone else. And so how we behave and treat our rivers has long-term impacts, big spatial scale impacts on people around us. So this is a map showing the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and that helps us recall that these varieties of scales are not always understood. The picture here at the top shows a 64,000 square mile watershed. That is the area of land that contributes water to this body of water called the Chesapeake Bay. Then, of course, as we drill down and focus in on the landscape scale, we can narrow in on a particular area that contributes water directly next to the Chesapeake Bay, such as Washington, D.C. And then as we drill in even further, we can find the Patuxent Stream corridor. And of course, there's a watershed that contributes water to that area with various cities involved next to Washington, D.C. And then as we keep drilling down, we can actually find a scale of what's called a reach, which is just several hundred meters of stream that includes riffles and pools like we saw in that first photograph. So while many of us are used to thinking of rivers that we experience on a daily basis, it's much better to think about river at a scale like this. In a sense, this is what we call a hierarchy, a hierarchical function that influences this idea that we've explored in ecology before called functional heterogeneity. So when we think about the stream at this scale, we can drill in and view a segment of that stream, and we realize that the shape of this stream is very much like the shape of that. It can almost be appear self-similar at all scales, be fractal. But of course, then if we drill on this, we see a different set of heterogeneity. We see places where the water's moving fast and places where it's deep. And then if we drill in on this, we see places where the sediment is mixed with cobble and places where it's just got sand, etc. So as we go from big stream scales down to microhabitats, we can think of all of these hierarchies along the river as habitat for different kinds of creatures that are obviously affected by our management of the river. Another way to talk about stream scale and hierarchy is what we call stream order. So this stream has a stream order of 4 because we have headwaters up here that get a designation of 1. So now we have a stream that contributes water with another stream into a larger stream. So this is the second order stream. And in this second order stream, we contribute water from this second order stream and this second order stream into this third order stream, etc. So the number of branches that occur in a river indicate how far upstream, in a sense, how distant, in many cases, how big the drainage area is for a river. So point 1, rivers integrate vast scales, and point 2, rivers are what we call ecotones. So as you might remember, an ecotone is a boundary between two ecological habitats that is in itself, therefore, a very unique habitat. So in the case of a river, we have this riparian community, which just means trees and plants that grow along a body of water that are very unique to that particular microhabitat. They are found here, but not so much in the upland environment. We find birds and species of insects and wetland plants growing right on the boundary. All of these represent a very diverse habitat that's important for the river's health, as we'll talk about in a bit. And one of the ways this ecotone is important to understand is that water flows across the surface of the land and goes into the river. So whatever it's flowing across is integrated in the river itself. And so we call that overland flow. And so here's a description of what would be a leaf litter in a forest. The rain comes down through the trees, hits the ground surface, and some of it seeps into the ground through the soil and eventually flows underground to the river. So what a lot of us probably assumed is that most of the water that runs into a river is from overland flow. Not so much. A lot of the water that flows into a river is actually from groundwater flow. That's why when it's not raining, the river's still flowing. So the groundwater, the surface of the river is usually the same as the surface of the groundwater. It's the saturated ground that holds water in all those pore spaces. So this is an important point for a couple reasons. It helps us understand that what we put on the land here or take away from the land is going to influence what ends up in our river, of course, in terms of erosion, etc. But it also helps remind us that what we put into the groundwater is also going to eventually show up in our river, though at some delayed timescales. Point number 3. Rivers are actually erosive forces. So this mountain looks like the Rocky Mountain National Park, but these mountains were actually also on the east coast of North America, next to the Chesapeake Bay watershed that I just showed you, which is now the Appalachian Mountains. They're much lower in elevation, much less jagged, much less peaked, and that's because they've been eroded. Those mountains along the Appalachian coast on the east coast of North America formed 250 million years ago. When Africa collided with North America, it caused a massive tectonic plate upheaval, pushed those mountains up. Now, of course, Africa and North America have been going apart ever since, and erosion is winning the battle. There's not as much uplift and there's more erosion. So those mountains have essentially been erased by rivers and deposited into our beaches and into our oceans. So as water moves down these steep slopes, of course, it has high velocity. It's pummeling little pebbles that are bouncing down the river, and that friction with pebble on pebble is why we have rounded rocks in rivers, because they get their edges knocked off. Eventually, that material gets deposited in the it moves through the transfer zone down to what we call the depositional zone, where the material is deposited. Now you know why beaches are sandy. They have mountain rock that got pummeled and resisted dissolving and eventually showed up at our beaches due to the action of rivers. So think of rivers as normal erosional agents that are carrying sediment and rock from mountains and depositing it into our oceans. Now, if we look at the same map and we think about the drainage area, the distance downstream, we can see what happens from these headwaters up in the mountains to those depositional areas. And we can follow along through these 3 categories and look at a variety of attributes. So let's look first at this blue line. We call that stream discharge. That's the total volume of water that goes by a point in a unit of time. So typically we define it as cubic feet per second. So it's how big is the hose that you've turned on in terms of how much water is gushing through the river. So these steep rivers have a very low discharge. They don't have a lot of volume of water because they're higher order streams. Lower order streams like 1s and 2s. As we get further downstream, we get into these higher numbers, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th order stream. And now we're integrating water from a bigger area of land, and therefore the volume and the discharge starts to go up. Okay? So that discharge has a lot to do with all of these other aspects here. It's actually created by this change in slope, right? But it's also created by the channel width. Channel width goes up, the channel depth goes up, and the velocity starts to go down. So that's why this area is a depositional environment. As we got more and more volume of water, it flows on a flatter and flatter plane and starts to flow in a slower area. Obviously, this is why we don't have rapids in Goshen, right? You can't go whitewater rafting in Goshen on the Elkhart River unless you go over the dam, which is a very short rapids ride. It's because, of course, we're on very flat terrain, and therefore the velocity, which is a part of the discharge, is very, very low. But it's because the channel width is so wide and the depth so high that even though the velocity starts to go down, the discharge goes up. Okay? Now, this red line here might be new to you. We call the bed of a stream the bottom, okay? And so the bed grain size is the size of the rocks on the bottom of the stream. And you'll notice that up here, it's quite high. And that's because the high velocity of water is removing all the small rocks because the force is so high and moving those small rocks down into this depositional environment. The only thing left behind are big boulders and rocks that the water cannot move. So that's why bed grain size goes down through this trajectory. And this last one is the relative volume of stored alluvium. You might remember from the previous lectures about soils is that alluvium is sediment deposited by water. Okay, so this is just saying that there's hardly any clay and sand up here, and there's lots and lots of sand down here in this depositional environment. Why? Because as the water volume starts to slow down in its velocity, that material settles out and gets deposited into rivers. So then when we think about this in another way, we could look at a first order stream, the second to fourth order, the fifth to 10th order, and it helps us to look at this particle size in a different sense. So this is the velocity of the flow. As we go from here to here, the velocity gets lower. The discharge, as we just said, gets higher, and the river starts to meander back and forth. It's not cutting down anymore, but it's eroding side to side because it's on a flatter floodplain. And so this is what we typically would find on the bottom of this river. This is what we would typically find on the bottom of that river, which, to make a point perhaps that is subtle but now more obvious, the substrate, what's on the river bed, influences the creatures that can live there. So that's what we mean by wash load versus bed load. And as I said, all of these rock particles in the bottom of a river get rounded because they're not still. They get moved along, even in a river that's moving relatively slowly for most of the year. Eventually you might have a flood that increases the velocity that's now big enough to carry many things that are on the bed. So as these small little pebbles get tumbled along, we call that saltation, when a rock pebble or a boulder or a cobble gets bumped along the bottom and it kind of follows this circular path like you see here. It starts to erode and make the pebble smaller and smaller and smaller. That's why we have sand on beaches at the ocean. So this saltation is a process where the river picks up the bed load and turns it into wash load temporarily while the velocity is really, really high. That leads me to big idea number 4. Rivers are constantly changing. If there are these erosive forces, they're always moving the land around them. We call that stream geomorphology. So how does the geology change shape due to the river flow? And so what I'd like to show you is a depositional river that starts to do what we call meandering. And I want to explain how meandering works. So what happens is, as the river flows downstream, its speeds at different components of the river, at different spaces in the river, is different. So when the river comes around this corner, its speed is higher right here, and it has to be higher because all the water has to stay together and move downstream. The discharge here is the same as the discharge here. Water in general is not significantly being added or lost over that short amount of area. So it's like a hose in your backyard. When you squeeze the hose, the velocity of the water goes up because the same amount of water has to move through the hose. Otherwise, it's clogged. We don't see a river, essentially in this case, being clogged. Therefore, the water, if it moves greater distance, has to go faster. So water's moving faster here, and it's by definition then moving slower here. So that means water in the inside of the bend is moving slower. That means its bed load, its wash load, is going to fall out and settle and become bed load. So we have material deposited here, but we have erosion occurring here. We call this a cut bank, and we call this a point bar. In other words, a sandbar. So here's another picture of it. Here's a point bar or a sandbar and a cut bank. So what happens is the river starts to meander because we're building bank here and we're cutting bank here. So this river is going to keep widening out along these these squiggly areas, right? So much so that someday it's going to try to go around the corner here, and if the spring flood is high enough, it's going to punch through this bank and straighten out again. Then the river that's left over, now most of the water just flows in its shortest path. This becomes isolated and eventually seals off. This fills in with sediment, plants start to grow, and we call this an oxbow lake. So you can see evidence of previous meanders that used to be oxbow lakes in a river that's a depositional river that's slowly meandering back and forth. This is true even for our river, the Elkhart River. This now shows an aerial view of the Elkhart River. Here's the Goshen Dam Pond. Here's, of course, Goshen College. So this is the meanders. This is the cut bank right here. This is a depositional point bar. It's coming screaming around here. Well, not so much screaming because it's been dammed up, but this is the old river channel that if we would let the water go past, this is what we would see remain, and all of this would dry up and become land that's now flooded. Okay, and actually it's in the process of becoming land in some places because so much of the water, so much of the wash load has been dumped in here because of the dam. The water no longer moves as fast, and so all the sediment that it was carrying, trying to wash it into Lake Michigan, now settles out and begins to cause a lot of siltation. And many of the community members along here are trying to gather enough money to pay to dredge this lake, to pull out this sediment that should have been washed downstream had the dam not been there. So now we can look at meandering from a cross section. This shows the highest velocity path that the water is flowing through the river. So here's our point bar and here's our cut bank. And in between these areas, we usually get riffles, shallow moving, fast water. It's got to be fast because now the depth is really small. And here the depth is big because the water's been scouring around the bank, creating a deeper pool. So usually we have riffles and pools and riffles in these crossover areas between these meanders. So if we looked at the cross section, drew a line across these in section C, for example, let's see where the diagram matches over here. I don't see the letter C, but this looks like it's trying to show one of these pool areas, and this is the shallowest area trying to show I guess this is trying to show the riffle. At any rate, if we did a cross section here, we'd have a high velocity in a very, very shallow area. If we did a cross sectional here, we'd have a deeper area that's slower moving, which I think they're trying to show is section G must be through one of these areas. Okay. Now, for river restorationists, we want a river to meander. Why? Because we want it to have a diversity of moving velocities. Why? Because we want the moving velocities to vary in their bed load and wash load and create different kind of substrates. Why? Because we want different kind of substrates for different kind of creatures, including different kind of plants. Okay? So the geomorphology, how a river moves, creates a whole diversity of habitats that we think create heterogeneity for the creatures that depend upon it. So this is an example of that. Here we have these deep pools, and in between we have these riffles, and a longer straight moving area we call a run. So in that last diagram, I think we had a run, a riffle, and a pool. And this gives you an idea of the difference. Riffles, again, are quite shallow, fast moving. Runs are intermediate in depth and more slow moving, and these pools are very slow moving. So we get all kinds of different creatures with all kinds of different habitats then. In a run, we get some spine sediments that settle out and some submerged vegetation. We don't get that in a riffle. It's too quick moving. Plants don't root there as well. But this clean gravel makes for excellent macrohabitat and excellent rock material for lithophilic spawners. And in these deeper areas, we have colder water for the fish to hang out, which increases the dissolved oxygen, the ability of the water to hold the dissolved oxygen, in addition to some fine sediments that help hold plants in terms of their rooting. So that talks about the spatial dimensions of a river and how we want that to vary. Now let me talk about the temporal variations, and we call this flood pulse. So we have periods of time where the river volume that's discharged in a typical environment, not at the Goshen Dam Pond because of the dam, but in a typical environment, we have a very shallow area, and then all of a sudden it floods due to mainly spring rains that come or snow melt, depending on what part of the world you're in. And we get these very deep environments that start to then push nutrients in the river the whole way up into the land. So that volume of water is really important because it now deposits new sediment up here that is nutritionally excellent for that ecotone, for that riparian area. And then, of course, as that recedes back and goes back to its, quote, normal non-flood stage, it allows plant material to grow there. Some of those sediments get washed back into the river and get further deposited downstream. So flooding is a useful disturbance. We think rivers should flood as ecologists, but it becomes very difficult to allow a river to flood if you don't have an intact riparian area around it. We're grateful here in Goshen. We do have Shoup Woods and Shoup Parsons Woods and other places where we're allowing the river to flood. But when it flows through downtown Elkhart, we pretty much want to try to keep it channelized so it doesn't take out the buildings, of course, that we've invested lots of money in. So these kinds of benefits are possible when we have a flooding environment. I mentioned that it restores the nutrients to the riparian area. As it floods, it gets a wider channel that allows its velocity to go down, and it prevents excessive erosion. It brings food to the river macros because as the water recedes back, it's pulling leaf material, etc., for those shredders and those creatures that eat the leaves. It provides excellent spawning. There's some rivers that flood in Brazil that the fish only spawn up here under the trees during these flood stages. And if you don't allow the river to flood, we don't have great fish habitat or great fish population dynamics. And sometimes riparian plants like willows, cottonwoods, etc., germinate only after these flushes of sediment in the riparian area. Which leads me to my last big idea for today's video, and that is the structure of the river, tying things together now, influences the composition of the creatures, a point I've already begun to discuss. We call that the river continuum concept. And it integrates everything we've talked about. So at these higher elevations, these lower stream orders, like stream order 1 or 2, where stuff is moving quite quickly, we have an intact riparian area that contributes lots of coarse particulate matter, which changes the macroinvertebrate community that can live there. So we have a lot of shredders that are eating up these leaves and some predators that eat the shredders, etc. Okay? As we get into this intermediate sized river, we get more and more volume of water. And you notice that now we have some submerged kinds of aquatic plants that start to grow there. And the overall area that's exposed to riparian starts to get reduced. We have more sunlight getting down into here. And so we start to grow phytoplankton. We might then have more grazers, though we have a few grazers up here. And it starts to decrease the amount of shredders, perhaps, because there's less leaf material, and we get more vascular plants that are rooted on the bottom. And then as we get way down here to like the broadest Mississippi kind of rivers, it changes its profile even more. In this case, we get collectors. All right, collectors are species that siphon out phytoplankton from the water, and they sift it out and eat that phytoplankton, all right? So collectors made a smaller proportion up here and up here also. Grazers were quite small up here. Grazers become bigger here because we have more algae down here living on the rocks, etc. We don't have rocks on the bottom. We got sediment on the bottom, so we have almost no grazers by the time we get down here. In each case, we have predators because they're all eating these other macroinvertebrates. But the percentage of the shredders and collectors and grazers changes because of the physical nature of the rivers. This also then would change the amount of fish we have. So these fish like cold, fast-moving oxygenated streams. Catfish are tolerant of low dissolved oxygen, slower-moving rivers that have a lot more productivity. So the whole entire food chain is dependent upon this variability of the physical structures of the river. So that is where I'm going to stop this video, and then in class we'll further discuss what this means for restoration of rivers now that we understand a little bit about their ecology.